Well, I'd like to begin and reiterate what Sherry Ann shared, that this is a hard topic. And I would say that it's a hard topic for anyone, regardless of your background. But it's especially difficult for those who have experienced sexual abuse, sexual violence, or sexual harassment. And for me, this topic raises many questions, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but I want to talk about it with you. I do request that we all exercise compassion when we talk about this topic and explore it together. You know, many people over the centuries have suffered sexual abuse. And the stories of the Bible really reflect to us what people experience in history and also today. Now, I need to say at the start, I am not an Old Testament scholar, and we are going to be based in the Old Testament, looking at Old Testament stories. But in addition to the Bible, I'm going to be using several main texts of Bible scholars, of Old Testament Bible scholars. And they are Richard Davidson's Flame of Yahweh. I'm also going to be using Phyllis Treble's Texts of Terror, and also Benita Williams' Battered Love, Marriage, Sex, and Violence in the Hebrew Prophets. So some questions for us to consider as we get started. Why are stories of sexual violence and abuse included in Scripture? Why are they there? What messages are being conveyed by the Bible writers in these stories? Right? What is the purpose? What is it that they're saying? What are the biblical laws regarding sexual abuse and assault? Why do some Bible writers use the language of sexual violence against women as a measure of God's judgment? And then lastly, how is the Bible used to support sexual abuse or sexual violence? And how can we change this narrative? I just want to also begin by saying something about contemporary sexual abuse language. You know, we have fairly articulate ways to describe sexual abuse, sexual violence, rape, sexual assault. Our words change, but we have fairly distinct definitions. So I just want to introduce this first and then say something, because if we understand the contemporary meanings, we need to be careful that we don't read those into the biblical narratives or even make assumptions about the biblical narratives, because we don't see our words for these things there, right? Just because the word rape isn't there, it doesn't mean that there wasn't some kind of sexual assault taking place. So I went to the trusty Center for Disease Control definition of sexual violence, which includes any sexual activity where consent is not freely given, right? Any sexual activity where consent is not freely given. This includes completed or attempted sex acts that are against the victim's will or involve a victim who is unable to consent through use of force or alcohol drug facilitation. Other forms of sexual violence are non-physically pressured unwanted sex, unwanted sexual contact, such as intentional sexual touching, or a non-contact unwanted sexual experience, such as verbal sexual harassment. All right, so we have these meanings, we have all these terms today, right? We are not going to find these exact terms in the scripture, so we need to come to terms with that and not just make assumptions about what we see or don't see as to how the Bible translators have come up with the language. All right, to begin with here, we need to recognize that the Old Testament condemns rape and forced sexual acts, right? It goes in direct opposition to the beauty of sex that is portrayed in Scripture. And that is sex that is based on love, on mutuality, and voluntary self-giving, right? And this includes marriage, right? Marriage is a voluntary relationship. It's based on love and mutuality. So if we look at stories where we don't see love, mutuality, and voluntary self-giving, right, we might want to question, is this portraying the beauty of sex that God created, or is it something else? Now, the first act of humans outside of Eden was that Adam knew Eve. Adam knew Eve, right? That was their word, yada, to know. It was a very intimate kind of knowing. It's the same word that's used to describe God's knowing of us. Now, clearly, that's not sexual. This goes beyond a physical act. But it refers to Adam having sexual relations with Eve, right? So it indicates this deep personal relationship with the one known. Think about the stories we look at. Is there a deep personal relationship with the one known? Therefore, to destroy or desecrate this most intimate relationship is perhaps one of the ugliest, most vile betrayals of all human relationships. And Richard Davidson notes this in Flame of Yahweh. It's a vile, horrendous betrayal. All right, the first story we're going to look at is the rape of Dinah in Genesis 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the region. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl to be my wife." Now Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his cattle in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him, just as the sons of Jacob came in from the field. When they heard of it, the men were indignant and very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The heart of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall live with us, and the land shall be open to you. Live and trade in it, and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor with you, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Put the marriage present and gift as high as you like, and I will give whatever you ask me. Only give me the girl to be my wife." So Dinah's brother's response is to insist that all the males in the town be circumcised. It continues in verse 25. On the third day, when they were still in pain, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city unawares and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. But they said, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" All right, so one of the issues that has come up amongst Bible commentators over the centuries, I'd say male Bible commentators, did Dinah consent? Did Dinah consent to what happened to her? Now, some of them argue that she consented to this. And the logic or the reason that they appeal to is, why was she still in Shechem's house, right? Why did the brothers have to come and remove her from there? She obviously consented to the whole thing, right? Another feature is, well, why was she out going to the market by herself, right? Right? What a tart, out wandering by herself. What was she thinking? Oh, yes, she said she was going to visit the women in the town. But really, in those days, oh, if you were unaccompanied, then obviously she was asking for it. So Richard Davidson, he argues that the phrase "lay with her" suggests the use of force in a sexual crime. So Dinah is the victim of a forcible rape. He took, he laid, he violated, expressed the single action of rape and his increasing use of violence. So this may be an example of a power rape. Power rape, because Shechem is the prince of the land, right? He's the most honored of all his family, right? And this doesn't lessen his crime. Just because you're powerful, just because you're rich, just because of your status doesn't mean that it's okay to rape. But in the situation of a power rape, that person is exercising their power or privilege. So the fact of whether or not she just went along with it is really irrelevant, because he was in power over her. And it was a forcible rape, right? It was an act of force, an act of violence against her. Well, what is the biblical response of the narrator? The Bible writer calls the violation of Dinah an outrage. It's the worst kind of crime. It's something that is absolutely unthinkable in Israel. Now, Dinah's brothers hold the entire city responsible for the crime. Their sense of moral outrage is followed by an act that disrupts the entire social order. They kill Shechem, they kill his father, and basically kill the males, and they plunder the city. Well, what happens to Dinah in the story? Well, she is silent. We don't hear from her, right? She is denigrated. She is oppressed. She never speaks, right? We don't hear her voice, right? It's all about, right, what the male characters say. Let's consider the response of Jacob. It seems like Jacob doesn't actually have a response, or his response is to say nothing, right? He held his peace until his sons came from the field. Now, contrast this to the sons who are outraged. They are outraged. They lied to Hamor and avenged their sister. But Jacob chides the sons for their response, right? Their response, should our sister be treated like a whore, right? It doesn't mean that Dinah has become like a prostitute, but Davidson notes their failure to defend their sister's honor would be tantamount to regarding her as if she were a harlot. The sons see very clearly that in rape, a man or a community treats a woman the way a harlot treats herself. That is, rape denigrates and violates a woman's whole being, body, mind, and spirit, right? But we may say that the response of Jacob seems rather pathetic, and we might wonder about that. All right, what are some of the ancient Near Eastern laws on rape, right? To get a handle on, right, what Shechem did and what were the types of laws that were in effect at the time, looking at Middle Assyrian laws in cases of rape of an unattached woman, meaning she's not engaged, using our language today, she's not engaged, she's not promised to anyone, she's single, she's not married. The rapist, if they are married, is to hand over their wife to be raped, right? The father has the right to demand the rapist marry his daughter with no right to divorce and pay the bride money, or he can take the bride money but not force his daughter to marry the rapist. If a woman is betrothed, meaning she's promised to marry someone, she's engaged, and she's raped, the rapist is to be punished by death, but the woman goes free. The rapist of a fully married woman also receives the death penalty, but the woman is not punished. If the act took place in the street, right, in a town, in an inhabited area with witnesses, the rapist is to be killed and the woman is not punished. If the act took place in the mountains, the woman is presumed innocent, right? There are no witnesses. The woman's innocence is presumed. Well, what about in the Pentateuch? Deuteronomy 22, 25 to 27 deals with forcible rape. But if the man meets the engaged woman in the open country and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. You shall do nothing to the young woman. The young woman has not committed an offense punishable by death, because this case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor, right? This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. Since he found her in the open country, the engaged woman may have cried for help, but there was no one to rescue her. So Davidson notes the biblical law assumes the woman's innocence without requiring witnesses. She does not bear the burden of proof to argue that she did not consent. Her innocence must be assumed, but the man who violates the woman in this way receives the death penalty, right? And a raped woman is free to marry anyone except a priest. Well, what about incest? I'm not covering any stories of incest today. Of course, the famous one is Tamar, but I at least want to consider some of the laws relating to incest because that is part of sexual abuse. So in the ancient Near East, gods and goddesses and members of royalty frequently engaged in incest, right? But it was forbidden for the common citizen. The Code of Hammurabi prohibits the following incestuous relationships with punishment. For the father-daughter incest, the father is banished from the city. For the father with a daughter-in-law, the father is bound and thrown into the river. For the son towards the mother, both are to be burned. The son, foster mother, after the father's death, the son is banished from the parents' home. What about incest in the Old Testament? Well, the Old Testament has forbidden degrees of closeness concerning sexual relationships within the family, right? And when we talk about family, we think of the immediate family, right? The nuclear family. But obviously, in that time, their concept of family was like an extended family, like it was like much bigger. So in Genesis, the only intergenerational liaisons considered incestuous, Abraham and Sarai, right? They broke the holiness code, but it was still accepted at the time for a man to marry his half sister. Right? So the biblical legislation concerning incest is submitted in the Book of the Covenant. It's not there from Exodus 19 to 24. But it's in the Holiness Code in Leviticus 18 and 20. So let's consider some of the phrases that's used there. We're not going to read through all of that, but this phrase, you shall not uncover the nakedness of, right, that's used over and over, is a euphemism for sexual intercourse, right? So they don't have words for sex, right, like we do today. They have different euphemisms which stand for. So you shall not uncover the nakedness of. Uncovering the nakedness of the male or father actually refers to having sex with his wife, protects the females in close blood relation or close relative through marriage. All right. So some people have wondered about there being an omission. There's no reference in Leviticus 18 to the prohibition of incest between a father and a daughter, right? Or why would that be? So it's claimed that the father-daughter incest is actually the most common type back then and today, but the opening verse covers it. In verse 6, none of you shall approach anyone near of kin, right, to uncover their nakedness. So close kin refers to flesh of his flesh, right? One's nuclear family. This includes mother, sister, and daughter, who are automatically forbidden. So incest with those closest to the male carries the heaviest penalty, which is execution. Sex with one's half-sister, mother's sister, or father's sister, both parties are cut off, banished, and the community will witness their premature death. All right, so that's some of the laws that we find in the ancient Near East and also in the Old Testament. All right, any guesses for the next story that we are going to be looking at? I'm sure you'll be aware of that. All right, David rapes Bathsheba. The story is in 2 Samuel 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." All right, how should we interpret this? Lauren mentioned at the beginning that some people say that Bathsheba was having an affair with David, right? I've heard sermons on this over the years saying, Bathsheba was basically a tart. Here she was, outside in full view, taking a bath, right? She was asking for it, right? She wasn't dressed. She shouldn't have been there, right? What a wicked woman, right? I can think of other stronger words that people have used to describe her, but I'm not going to say that here. But commentators on this story typically implicate Bathsheba as responsible and absolve David. Well, Richard Davidson disagrees with this based on the following. David's moral failure is pivotal in his life, right? This is like a downward step that he takes, which results in the decline of his kingdom because of this great sin, of his great sin. So nothing in the Bible is mentioned of the sin of Bathsheba. It's not there, right? The Bible writers do not make her responsible. They don't implicate her. It's David's great sin. The rape of Bathsheba is another example of a power rape. So Bathsheba is subject to the king's power and authority, right? David is in a position of power and he sexually victimizes Bathsheba. So there's no need for any consent or not consent to be given. He is in a power position over her and she is therefore, right, forced to submit to that. David was at home when he should have been with his army, with his men. Bathsheba was being faithful. She was faithfully participating in a prescribed ritual bath that women took, right, during a set time. She was acting in a godly, righteous way when she was taking that bath. David was strolling on the rooftop at this time of day, which Davidson says was the first step in his moral downfall. It was inappropriate for him to be there since that was the time baths were to be taken. He should not have been on that rooftop, right? Going up there at that time, he was, right, setting out as the peeping Tom. So she was righteous. It's not her sin. This is David's sin. How in the world did commentators and preachers get this backward and messed up? All right, then the story progresses when Nathan the prophet comes to David and he tells David the story of a wealthy man who took a little ewe lamb from another, right? And this other man, the only little sheep he had was that little ewe lamb that he loved. And this little lamb represents the innocence of Bathsheba, right? Represents her innocence, a lamb. She's represented by a lamb, right? Think about that. Who else is represented by a lamb? Well, Bathsheba is represented as a lamb, but it's the sin of David. And Nathan the prophet, describes the sin of that as that of David alone, right? It's David alone. Bathsheba is the wife and daughter of two of David's 30 chiefs who were his close comrades before he was king. Bathsheba's grandfather was David's personal counselor. So David took the wife, the daughter, and granddaughter of his close friends who had been loyal to him. And of course, he has Uriah make sure that he is killed in the front of battle. So on the rooftop where David's sin began is where he will be punished. He will begin to be punished. His concubines, right? He flees and his concubines are raped by his son on the rooftop in plain sight. So Absalom, his son, had revolted against his father David and made himself king. When he saw his son gaining power, David fled from Jerusalem with his entire household except for 10 concubines. These women were to run the palace in David's absence. Absalom then arrived in the capital with his men and asked for advice from Ahithophel on how to strengthen his position. Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone will be with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, it was apparently a common practice back then when a king's power was challenged, or when a king took over from another king, they would inherit the concubines from the father or the previous ruler. And the fact that he take them and rape them, it was saying he was declaring, right, that he was taking over from David as king, right? So his own son is challenging and revolting from him. Well, we have Psalm 51, which you aren't aware. Psalm 51 is the psalm that David wrote after Nathan the prophet had come to visit him, and he recognized, I don't know, perhaps for the first time, of his great sin. And this is what he says. I always read this to my students after we've looked at the rape of Bathsheba, to see David's response. He writes, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness, and let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then will you delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. So that is David's response. All right, the next story, I'm not sure if it goes in increasing shockingness, but this is one of the stories that Phyllis Tribble looks at. She looks at 4 stories in her text of terror. And this story not only includes sexual assault, rape, sexual abuse, but gang rape, torture, mutilation, right, dismemberment, murder. And this comes from Judges 19. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the 2 of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines." So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now the day has waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry, and tomorrow you shall rise early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." He said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and after they washed their feet and ate and drank, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." Well, I won't read the rest of the story continuing into Judges 20 and 21, but I do want to cover some of the consequences of the gang rape of the concubine. And that is that in Judges 20, 400,000 men of Israel, they demand an answer from the Levite who misstates the intentions of the men of Gibeah and leaves out information about what really happened. He says to them, "And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. So I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel," right? For they have committed abomination, right? In fact, from the story, right, their intent was never to kill the man, right? They said they wanted to know him, right? And we looked at the beginning, that word yada, to know, right, describes Adam and Eve having sex, having sexual relations, right? So the men wanted to have sexual relations with the master. He also leaves out the fact that he seizes her, he grabs her and thrusts her outside to the men, right? She is dead. In fact, if she is dead, actually, we don't even know if she is dead. All we know is that, she's laying there. She's not saying anything, right? She actually could have been alive still when he dismembered her, right? She's dead not because they killed her, right? Rather, he is the murderer. So the tribes of Israel then demand that Benjamin give up the men of Gibeah, right, so they can kill them. So they attack the town. Over 25,000 Benjamite men die in a day. Also, no women, children, or animals or beasts survive, right? They wipe out everyone, right? The women, the children, and even the little animals. But 600 men, 600 of the Gibeonite men, they escape into the wilderness. Now, the other tribes, they attack the town of Jabesh Gilead because they're concerned, right, that these 600 men is all that is left of the tribe of Benjamin, and how will this line survive? So they attack this town, Jabesh Gilead, and they murder everyone except for 400 virgins. And they turn over these 400 virgins to the 600 men of Benjamin, and the 400 women are raped. Now, this doesn't satisfy them. So the men of Israel also abduct 200 young women of Shiloh when they came out to dance. And they are also given to these 600 Benjamites, right, to rape or do what they want to. So Phyllis Tribble notes in Texts of Terror that in total, the rape of one has become the rape of 600. Entrusted to Israelite men, the story of the concubine justifies the expansion of violence against women. What these men claim to abhor, they have reenacted with vengeance, right? Over and over again. They have captured, betrayed, raped, and scattered 400 virgins of Jabesh Gilead and 200 daughters of Shiloh. Furthermore, they have tortured and murdered all the women of Benjamin and all the married women of Jabesh Gilead. Israelite males have dismembered the corporate body of Israelite females. Inasmuch as men have done it unto one of the least of women, they have done it unto many. Tribal Israel failed to direct its heart to the concubine, right? And instead, they repeated the violence, right? Hundreds of times over to other innocent women. All right, after this, a law, emerges on marriage to female captives. We find this in Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14, or this is then outlined in scripture. It says, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. The word that's used here is for forced sexual acts in scripture. All right, so we may want to say, is this in fact a rape, right? Is the woman consent? She's a captive, right? The captor is in power over her, right? Raises some questions, right? They tried to set up a law to protect, right, female captives of war. All right, now we move on to the last part, which is language of violence used against women in the prophets. Now, God in the prophets, some of the prophetic writers, God is described as a faithful husband, and Israel is likened to an adulterous wife who is promiscuous. So sexual promiscuity becomes a metaphor for Israel's treaties with other nations and their adoption of their religious practices. So some examples, domestic violence metaphor in Hosea 1 to 3, where Hosea, right, and by connotation is saying God threatens to expose her nakedness, his wife Gomer's nakedness, and be given to other men to be raped and beaten. Ezekiel 16 and 23 refer to the sexually promiscuous wife who is to be publicly shamed by exposing her genitals, rape, beating, mutilation. From Tamar Kamionkowski, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Violence Against Women in the Hebrew Bible. She writes, perhaps the most insidious type of violence against women appears in the form of a metaphor in prophetic literature. It is important to note that we know very little about the real-life experiences of violence for ancient Israelite women. In other words, violence against women in the Bible is a literary convention. Right, let's briefly turn to Hosea to look at an example, then I'll say a few things. So this is from chapter 2. Say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. That she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no mercy, because they are the children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. And I will put an end to all her mirth, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned offerings to them, and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, declares the Lord. All right, how should we understand this? So Benita Williams writes about the language of sexual violence in Hosea and other passages in the Old Testament, how the prophets use cultural stereotypes about women in their time to evoke strong emotional reactions of shock, horror, and disgrace by men being compared to degenerate women. She writes, the 8th century prophet Hosea performed his rhetorical tasks skillfully. He captured in the marriage metaphor some of the most cherished cultural notions dear to his audience: power, honor, security, and justice. He manipulated stereotypical images of women in assorted sexual dramas to evoke a range of emotions in his audience. For example, shock, shame, fear, comfort, and horror. The success of Hosea's attempt to persuade his audience of their blatant disloyalty to the covenant that their ancestors had made with Yahweh, whether by aligning themselves with foreign powers or by absorbing foreign religious practices into the Yahweh cult, lay in his ability to use imagery of sex, romance, and violence to appeal to his audience's inherited cultural values, exploit their greatest fears, and evoke their most sacred traditions. So this is Bonita Williams explaining, right, the use of sexual violence against women as a metaphor in the Hebrew prophets. And that is the end of the presentation.